Hi everybody, greetings from what is perhaps today not such a lovely day here in Cape Town. It's cold and wet outside, but it's very nice indoors. And this lovely classical setting is part of a home that belongs to a lady that works with me. And when she heard this morning that I was planning on shooting a movie, she said, well, why don't you go down to my place? Here are the keys, you'll be alone and undisturbed there. And so I'm very grateful to her for the opportunity. Of course, we're not entirely alone. We have Claudia here, and she's more than welcome to listen in as we talk about early Rhodesian history. I'd like to focus this morning for a bit on the Jameson raid. This was a military engagement between troops of the British South Africa Company from Rhodesia and Boers in South Africa. Now, Frederick Burnham was a famous American scout, a man with a vast knowledge and experience in Indian warfare. He came out to Africa in those days, threw in his lot with the Rhodesians, and had this to say about the Boers. When it comes to cunning and patience and stealth and resourcefulness on the battlefield, the American Apache is matched only by the South African Boer. And Winston Churchill, that great statesman, who knew the Boers very well, he described them in this way, that not since the time of the Mongols has the world seen a more formidable mounted warrior race. So that gives you some idea what the Rhodesians were up against when they crossed the border into South Africa on Old Year's Day, 1895, and marched on Johannesburg. Yeah, it certainly changed history. Within days of the raid, Britain and Germany were on the brink of open warfare. It didn't happen then, but the raid certainly triggered a colossal arms race between those two nations. And this culminated in the First World War, and as you know, sadly, the loss of millions of lives. The raid also led directly to the South African Boer War. It was, if you like, the tinderbox that set the veld afire. So it was an event of great significance, and wherever you are today, you can be certain that the world you find yourself in has been largely formed and shaped by the events that took place on the Jameson raid. So what could possibly have caused something like this? What were the reasons for this history-changing event? In the 1800s, gold was discovered in the Boer Republic of the Transvaal, and a place called Johannesburg arose almost overnight to become a thriving city. It was known as the City of Gold, and people came from far and wide, from all over the world, to come and work on the mines, to earn an honest living, provide for their families. And you would imagine that where there's gold, there'd be wealth, and where there's wealth, there'd be money, and where there's money, surely there must be good infrastructure and sound governance. Well, that certainly wasn't the case in Johannesburg in those days. The people there, the miners, lived under the most appalling conditions. If you moved away from the city area, I mean, there was no proper town planning in place. There were shanty towns around there, made from old biscuit tins that had been beaten flat. And this is where the miners had to live. I'm not talking only here about African miners. I'm talking about Germans, and I'm talking about Britons, and I'm talking about Americans. Yes, many of them were common miners, if I may be excused for using that expression. But a great many of them were mine technicians, and mining engineers, and mining managers. One and all, they faced the same discomforts, the terrible conditions that they had to live in. The streets were piled high with horse manure that was never removed. The place stank to high heaven. Refuse wasn't carted away as it should have been. And the ironic thing about it all is that Johannesburg was administered by a so-called sanitation committee at that time, who it seemed couldn't care less. And I saw some figures, when you live like that, it's inevitable that the health of the population is going to suffer. And at that time, the record shows that 54 people in every 1,000 perished as a result of poor sanitary conditions. Now that's a very high statistic. And yet you might say, well, 1,000 people is, it's quite a sizable crowd, and 54 people can get lost very easily amongst them. So maybe it's not such a bad percentage. But by comparison, if you look at the World Health figures, the WHO made an estimate, and they said this pandemic that we are just going through now, and we seem to be hopefully getting to the tail end of it, although I believe they are talking about an upsurge again now. The estimate globally for the number of people that have succumbed to that disease is 34 people in every 1,000. So here is a pandemic that has stood the world on its ear and brought us untold suffering and misery of every description. We still haven't seen the end of it, and it's something that we're not going to forget in a hurry. We compare that with something which was almost twice as bad in Johannesburg at that time. It gives us some idea of what the conditions were that the people lived under. And you might say to yourself, well, now, was it necessary for them to live like that? Why didn't they do something about it? The fact was that they could do nothing about it. The country was administered and run by the Boers, and the Boers were indifferent. As far as the Boers were concerned, they would be happier if these people, these miners, Uitlanders as they called them, just packed up their stuff and left the country. But, that was wishful thinking. The fact of the matter was, although the Uitlanders, and this was evidence that was led by Cecil John Rhodes in an inquiry into the Jameson raid, after this event had taken place, Rhodes pointed out that the Uitlanders occupied more than half of the built-up areas of the Transvaal. Nationally, they outnumbered the Boers by a vast margin. But more importantly, the Uitlanders contributed 95% of the taxes that went into the state coffers. So on the one hand, it was very easy for the Boers to say these people should just leave and go back to where they came from. We can do without them. But, the money that they brought in was of some significance, and, So anyway, while they prepared to work like that, we let them work. But man, we ain't going to make it easy for them. In a crude way, that was the attitude. They were Uitlanders. They couldn't set up boards and councils to have the streets and that cleaned up. They were not authorized to do things like that. That was the job of the Boer authorities, who sadly were just incompetent and indifferent and couldn't be bothered. But the Uitlanders did form themselves into a committee called the Reform Committee, and they made representations to Kruger himself. And so while there was a lot of dissatisfaction in Johannesburg, they would sit down in this atmosphere, almost of hostility, make their grievances known to him. And the old man, he was a sly old guy, He wasn't blind, and he wasn't stupid. And, for all his faults, I think that deep down he was a bit of a kind man, but not in respect to the Uitlanders. He'd listen to what they have to say, and his way was to agree with them. Yes, this is not acceptable. I will have something done about this. And so the meeting would be closed off, and people would leave there with great hope. Things are going to change now. We're going to see a different Johannesburg. The old man, Uncle Paul, is going to get involved here. But Uncle Paul was just talk. He wasn't going to do anything. And as for the sanitation committee, oh dear, they were even more useless. Alexander the Great once saw a soldier doing something wrong, and he decided that he would deal with this himself. So he had this defaulter brought before him, and the general said to him, "What's your name?" And the soldier replied, "Alexander." And he said, "You got the same name as I have?" He said, "Yes, sir." He said, "Well, then I only got one thing to say to you. You either change your ways or you change your name. But the sanitation committee wasn't prepared to do anything like that. And so this shocking situation, this unhealthy environment that people had to live in, continued for many years after the raid. In fact, it got to the point where a real dramatic move took place, where the Johannesburg Fire Department set fire to an entire suburb and burnt it to the ground. 1,600 homes destroyed by fire, by their own fire department, to try and stop a plague and to prevent disease spreading further. So let's just accept that the Uitlanders had good cause for being unhappy. They had good cause for believing that nothing was going to change, and they had good cause for believing that the only way that they could improve their lot was through armed rebellion. John Hayes Hammond was a very influential American. He was a good businessman, a brilliant mining engineer, but I think he was also a man with great empathy who could feel for the lot of other people. And a year or so before the raid took place, while he was in Rhodesia, touring the various mines in company with Cecil John Rhodes and with Dr. Jameson, he started talking about the plight of the Uitlanders in Johannesburg. And if I was to paraphrase what he said, it was words to the effect that there's going to be an uprising there. Nothing is going to improve until that happens. Those poor people are living under the most deplorable conditions, and I see no other way out of this. Now, Kruger at the time was making things very difficult. He had a love for Hollanders, which is nothing wrong with that. He brought these people out, appointed them to positions in the civil service, and they ran the place. And that was okay for the Boer. The Boer had no problem communicating with them or understanding them. But for the Uitlanders, it was really awful. I mean, there was still red tape and stuff that had to be attended to in those days, just as it is today. But it's very difficult when you're sitting opposite a civil servant and he can't understand what you're saying, and you certainly can't understand what he's saying. And so that was one of the vexing sort of things. Of course, the Uitlanders were disenfranchised. They couldn't vote, they couldn't elect anybody. Kruger would periodically have them called up and put them on the border to keep belligerent blacks away from the Boer Republic. So there was that as well that caused a little bit of dissatisfaction. And then he had a railway system constructed called the Nederlandse Railways. And if you moved goods to Johannesburg along the normal rail network that was in existence at that time, you were required to pay exorbitant levies. So it was a real problem. So when these trains would arrive at the Vaal River, which was the boundary between the Orange Free State and the Transvaal, you'd have to load the stuff off of the train and put it onto a wagon, and then the wagon would move across a drift, which is a causeway. And then it proceed from there to Joburg by ox wagon. So Kruger was quite happy to, sort of restrict what was then a state-of-the-art, world-class industry to the pace of a walking ox. Never mind the railways, never mind technology. We go back to the old days. Unless you want to, pay the fines. This is the kind of thing that was taking place days before the raid. There was a lot of nepotism too in the government. You had to know somebody to get anywhere, and families were well looked after, as we shall see, and I'll relate an example for you as we go along. And Hayes Hammond spoke about all of this kind of thing. And Dr. Jameson and Rhodes listened with keen interest. Now, Rhodes was a man who, he seemed to have a very soft spot in his heart for, shall I say, widows and orphans. When Lobengula died, Rhodes made certain that Jimmy Dawson was sent out into the bush, go and look for Lobengula's wives, look for the children, bring them all back safely to Bulawayo, and Lobengula's children were in fact raised in Rhodes's own house. So when he heard of the difficulties that the Uitlanders were facing and you know, children dying from disease and that, it touched a chord with him. And he said to Jameson afterwards, on your way home back to Cape Town, I want you to come see me, but stop by in Joburg. Just make some inquiries of your own if you don't mind, and just check out the things that we've been told. And Jameson did that. He stopped by, met with the Reform Committee in Johannesburg, but he wasn't as interested in what they had to say as what the perspective was from the mine workers. And so Dr. Jim spent some time in the homes of the miners, and he listened to what they had to say. And then after that, he travelled down to Cape Town, met with Cecil Rhodes, and he said to him, everything we heard from Hayes Hammond is true. Those people are living under shocking conditions, and there's a lot of resentment, a lot of unhappiness, and I'm afraid that he's right. There's going to be a rebellion there. There's going to be an uprising. Now, this is not a good thing. And you can imagine that Rhodes would have been alarmed by it, and Jameson too. These are civilians, and they want to take on the Boers. You know, and not only are they civilians, they're unarmed civilians. And very few of them have got any military experience. I mean, they're miners. As I said earlier, some of them had been called up to the border to serve the Boers there as a sort of a barrier between the hostile natives and the Boer farmers. But apart from those few, most of them had no military experience. And to want to have a punch-up with the Boers, they were biting off more than they could chew. As the British found out at Majuba, they saw stars there after the Boers had finished with them. So, you know, this was not a good situation from the point of view of Rhodes. So he said, look, the best we can do under these circumstances is let's think about it a little, but let's send them some weapons so that at least they can be protected if the worst comes to the worst. So something like about 2,000 rifles and a handful of Maxim guns were smuggled into Johannesburg through the efforts of one of the engineers there. Gardner Williams was his name, also a very good man, a well-known figure, and through using the De Beers company that Rhodes owned. But of course, you can't keep these things secret. The arms arrived there in Joburg, and very soon the story got out, and the newspapers got hold of it and blew this thing out of all proportion. So you can imagine the old man was not too pleased to hear these stories, but he'd been hearing them for some time from his agents on the ground. So, you know, he just kept his quick counsel, kept quiet. But the, shall I say, the average Boer was also aware of this. I mean, he read the newspaper and he listened to gossip as well as anybody else did. And they became quite agitated at this. They approached their president and they said, you know, what are we going to do about this? These Uitlanders are arming themselves, and we're going to end up with a war here in this country. We better take them out now before they get any stronger. And Kruger famously replied to that by saying, just be patient. It's like killing a tortoise. If you want to kill a tortoise, you've got to wait until he sticks his head out of his shell, and then you cut it off. So leave them. Now is not the time to act against them. We had this situation now in Joburg, where there was open ferment. The Boers were now arming themselves, walking the streets, ready to take on any Uitlander who showed any sign of aggression. And so the city was filled with tension, and the prospect of violence became ever more possible. And Rhodes and Alfred Byte, Jameson discussed this, and they said, look, this thing is going to happen whether we want it or not. The only thing we can do is to try and give them some sort of support and try and make this whole thing, this whole event, as painless and as bloodless as possible. But in order to do that, we're going to need some troops. Where on earth are we going to find troops that we can use to protect the Uitlanders against the Boers? And the only place where they could find troops, of course, was in Rhodesia. But, you know, you had the company, British South Africa Company, that would have to pay for this. So first of all, the shareholders and the directors there would have to be convinced of the necessity of increasing the armed force in Rhodesia. And I mean, you can't tell them we want an armed force so that we can invade the Transvaal. They never agreed to that. They're not going to put their money behind a scheme like that. And then, of course, the British also needed to be convinced that there was a good reason for increasing the number of troops. And they came up with a plan eventually. They said, look, what we'll do is we're going to be building a railway line along the Bechuanaland border. So let's tell everybody concerned that we need to raise a force to protect the workers building the railway line. And then once the line is in operation, you know, to stop any hostile moves on the part of the Africans living in the area, we'll need to keep a presence there. So that sounded quite plausible. And Rhodes and Jameson went over to England, met with the imperial government there, and not only convinced them that this would be a good idea, but the British were quite happy and said, look, we have been thinking for a while about disbanding the Bechuanaland Border Police. Would you be interested in taking over the men and their stores and equipment? We'll transfer them over to your company. Well, that was wonderful. I mean, yeah, they're getting extra men, trained men, and very good men too. You know, the Bechuanaland Border Police, you know, if I can just digress for a moment. When we think of police forces today, you know, we think of a guy maybe standing at an intersection directing traffic, or somebody that comes to your house to investigate a burglary, or somebody that, a police force like that. But the police forces in those days in Africa, they performed a dual function. So not only were they policemen and law enforcement officers, they doubled up as soldiers. They could do either job equally efficiently. And the Bechuanaland Border Police was such a force, and it was a very fine force. If you ever wondered, for those of you who were Rhodesians, what that force looked like, you only needed to look at our British South Africa Police, because many of the traditions and the ways of the Bechuanaland Border Police was carried over into our own police force. So the one was almost like a mirror image of the other. Yeah, that was nice. Now they had these men, and it looked like there might be quite a few hundred of them coming over to be employed by the company. And then they thought, well, we're going to need to back this up a little bit. Let's increase the size of the force in Rhodesia itself. So they created a volunteer force there under Colonel Spreckley. 1,000 men, horsemen, and the idea was, look, we'll just keep them in reserve there. We know what we want to do. We're gonna walk into the Transvaal. We're gonna march on Johannesburg, and we're gonna be there to support the Uitlanders. But we'll just keep Spreckley there in Rhodesia with those men in case we need him. They sold this idea to the company directors, and they accepted it. They increased the force, I think, from something like 350 men up to 1,500. No problem. They voted the money for that. Okay, now they got the men on the border, very close to Joburg, in fact, the place where they stationed them. And it was a little place called Pitsani. And there's a farm outside Pitsani that they chose. And there they gathered the men together, and things moved very quickly. This was at the end of 1895. In December, they set the camp up. I think it was in October that year. But as things moved toward the end of the year, they were ready. It was out of the way. The security was good. It was not likely that the Boers would know immediately what this force was on their border. And if they did hear, they would be told, well, they're there to protect the railway. And in fact, the ruse worked. Kruger had no idea. He knew that the people in Joburg were dissatisfied. He knew there was a rebellion coming. But he had no idea that there were troops, like within about 3 days' march of Johannesburg, ready to move into the country. And not only ready to move in, who were planning on moving into the country. He did not know that at all. In Joburg, the plan was this. Okay, you guys can't take on the Boers, but what you can do is march on Pretoria, because there's an arsenal there which is very, very poorly guarded. Attack that place, take up all those arms and retire back to Joburg. By the time you are en route back to Joburg, we will have forces moving into the country to come and back you up. And with the arms out of the hands of the Boers, apart from whatever their own personal weapons might be, but the heavy stuff, the artillery and all of that, would be denied them. That was the plan. And the resurrection was set to occur on a certain day. And everybody was aware that this was the program, including Jameson at Patsani. But then it seemed as though Kruger, sensing that this thing was imminent, called for a meeting with the Uitlanders. And he said, look, we've got to sort out the situation, and try and make life a little bit easier for you. And I think we're going to do such and such, and we're going to do this and that. And how does this strike you guys? And they thought, man, this is what we wanted all the time. Why are we talking about armed rebellion when by constitutional means we can get the same thing? So suddenly the committee in Joburg didn't want to mix it with the Boers anymore in a military sense. Kruger had calmed them down and had given them this hope again that things were going to change. So of course Jameson was told, whoa, hold your horses, don't come storming into the country here, because we think we've got this thing under control. Dr. Jim at Patsani wasn't so happy to hear about that, because this is not the kind of thing you can have on and off while people are talking about it and deciding what they want to do. Sooner or later the word was going to get out to the Boers, and the last thing he wanted was to cross the frontier and find himself confronted by a row of angry Boer soldiers. So he wanted to get on with it. The people in Joburg, the Reform Committee, must have been very confident of victory. And I say that because in their discussions, they now started talking not so much about how the arsenal was going to be attacked, how the men were going to get there, how they were going to retire back onto Joburg. It wasn't those kind of discussions anymore. It was, what flag are we going to fly after we take over the country? That's how self-assured they were that they were going to be victorious. And this is where the whole undoing of this thing took place. Because the Americans said, well, what's the problem with the flag? We fly the flag that we got now. We're still going to have the Republic. We haven't got a problem with the Republic over here. We've got a problem with the way that it is organized and the way that it is run. But we're just going to change the way that representation is done here so that people are franchised. They got the franchise and they can vote, and that's it. And we do it along American lines. What's wrong with the way that we do it back home? We do it here. Why do you want to change the flag? Oh, and this alarmed Rhodes considerably. And he said, oh, guys, you're dealing with Boers over here. You might overcome them in the short term, but you've got them living in this country, and if they're unhappy, how are you going to deal with it? This needs something a lot more than just your little domestic government here. You need the backing of the crown here. No ways, it's got to be the Union Jack. The Transvaal must revert to total control by the imperial government. Union Jack flies. Republic, do away with it. The Americans said, no ways, we're not having that. And there was a complete breakdown in talks, as a matter of fact. And they said, look, we postpone everything. No uprising, nothing's going to happen. We talk again in January next year, 96. And this is the message that Jameson gets. You can't come into the country because we've hit a stalemate, we're busy sorting things out. He's totally unimpressed with us. And he sends Rhodes a message. And he says, if I don't hear from you to the contrary, tomorrow I'm moving into the country. I'm taking my boys and we're going in. And this telegram doesn't get through to Rhodes at all. The next day, Jameson sends another one. He says, tonight I'm crossing the border and I'm into the Transvaal and I'm marching on Joburg. And by the time that Rhodes gets those two telegrams, it is too late. Jameson has taken the decision to move his men into the Transvaal. I think the historical record is quite clear that if blame needs to be apportioned for the Jameson raid, then that blame needs to be directed solely at the Boers, and more especially at their president, Paul Kruger. Had the Uitlanders been treated differently, had they been granted the franchise, had they been allowed to vote and bring about positive change in the Transvaal, that raid would never have taken place. I suppose we could say, in defense of the Boers, that they were doing the best that they could under the circumstances to protect their own culture and identity. I think they foresaw the time that if the Uitlanders were allowed to vote, that the policies of the Transvaal would change to such an extent that the Boer way of life would have been eroded. Nevertheless, despite that fear on their part, it is no excuse and it doesn't justify in any way the treatment that was handed out to the Uitlanders. Well, let's just leave it at there for the moment. We've covered quite a bit of ground. We've looked at the background to the raid. I think when we meet again, we will look at Jameson's march across the border and toward Johannesburg. And we may have to follow that up with a third part dealing with the aftermath of the raid. But before we say goodbye this morning, I would like to just extend a very special word of thanks to our friends and our patrons, those kind, generous folk who have provided money to this channel. And let me just hasten to say this, okay? None of the money that has come to 5RR has been used for wine, women and song, if I can put it that way. This money has enabled me, you know, I did say, I think on a previous occasion, that I have left my full-time employment now. I've retired from a place where I worked for something like 17 years as a factory manager, and I have a small little place of my own. It's not very big. There's only 3 little injection molding machines there. But the money that you have contributed has enabled me to have molds made. And this tooling is running at the moment. And as a result of that, it has provided employment for 3 people. There are 3 households now at my little factory that can put food on the table. Let me tell you, things are very difficult in this land. I don't know how they are in the rest of the world. I suppose nothing is easy anywhere these days. But here it's very difficult. We have an extremely high unemployment rate. And to find work, it's almost impossible. And yet through your generosity, okay, you have now made it possible for 3 families to have a regular income. And I think that's marvelous. It's wonderful what you've done. And, you know, words alone cannot express the gratitude that these people have and that I have for the way in which you have helped. So thank you for that. And we have never done this before, but we'd like to acknowledge you. And we're going to put your names up. And if you think there's a bit of a fanfare, well, you deserve it. That is a lovely tune. It's a march composed by a man by the name of Charles Warren Day, and he was an early pioneer. He was the bandmaster of the British South Africa Company and then later the British South Africa Police. He also happens to be the great-grandfather of a very, very good friend of mine who was the best man at my wedding, William Peter Day. So I'm happy to have been able to share that with you. Folks, I'm not going to carry on any further. Thank you very much for all of you for your interest in Rhodesian history. I wish you well wherever you are. Take care, and until we meet again, cheers.